At the beginning of the Civil War, emancipation was not its goal. Well, what was its goal? Union. Right? Lincoln said, "This is essentially a people's struggle. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of man, to afford all, an unfettered start, and a fair chance in the race of life." Right? This is standard free labor ideology. And it's not, the war is not about emancipation. It's not about slavery at that point, because Lincoln sees that then it would alienate the border states and the conservative Northerners. That doesn't mean that slavery was not at the heart of the differences between the North and the South, and the heart of why they could not get along and why the war happened. But it was not the goal of the war. Those are two separate things. Well, so what was the goal for the Civil War for the South? For the South, it was their goal was to preserve their way of life, right? Fearing what the president might do. But even while whites were ignoring the issue, slaves in the North and the South kept calling the war the Freedom War. Right? They saw this as a war to end slavery. So slaves in large numbers during the Civil War took matters into their own hands and ran away. Right? They headed for Union lines, and unlike earlier runaways, which was mostly young men who would run away from slavery, during the Civil War, runaways were women, were children, as well as young men. When they went on to the Union armies, they passed on information about the Confederacy Army and the lines. They started to refuse to work unless they were paid wages. And this is overwhelmingly confusing to slave owners. Slave owners this time cannot understand why their family slaves, their happy, childlike family slaves, would run away. Right? They're not understanding that this was all a pattern that they had created in their head, that the whole idea of the happy slave family was something that was completely artificial, that was only in their heads and wasn't truly real. Now, the Union Army and especially the federal government didn't know what to do with all the runaways. So abolitionists start making the argument that emancipation is necessary. Look at all of the slaves that are running away. If you made emancipation, all the slaves would be freed. That would weaken the South so much that the war could be won. The biggest advocate for immediate emancipation during the Civil War was this man, Frederick Douglass, and we've talked about him before. And he said, "It is futile to separate the freedom of the slave from the victory of the government." Right? These are the two things that are tied in the Civil War. He says, "Fire must be met with water, darkness with light, and war for the destruction of liberty must be met with war for the destruction of slavery." Right? And slowly Congress starts coming around in support of these arguments. Now, for Lincoln for the longest time opposed emancipation. Right? When Missouri proposed emancipation in 1862 during the war, he rescinded it. He said, no, not at this point. When freeing slaves in D.C., he required that each owner got compensated for each slave that was freed. He even tried to send slaves to the Caribbean for resettlement. And in August 1862, he meets with black leaders, and they encourage him they ask him to support that immigration. They say, you and we are different races. It is better for us to be separated. So he's very much of these segregation. If there is freedom, then go towards colonization or segregation. But at some point he changes his mind and decides that emancipation is a political and military necessity. Well, why does he do that? It turns out that he needs more soldier, right? He's not getting enough white men to fight the war, and so he needs more fighters, and blacks are willing to fight. He also needs some international support, and he's not going to get a lot of international support until he does this. And when it becomes clear that this is the way he's going, it turns out that it's not, people don't react well. Republicans immediately lose seat in elections to Democrats. People are afraid they'll lose their jobs to slaves or freed slaves, and that white men are afraid they'll lose their white daughters to black men. So there's a lot of fear about emancipation. But eventually Lincoln goes forward. So on January 1, 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees all slaves in the Confederate areas. So the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't actually free a single slave, right? It doesn't free them in Union areas that have slaves. It only frees people in the Confederacy, which the federal government has almost no jurisdiction over because they're at war. However, the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation sets off a series of celebrations in the South among slaves, right? It's a signal of change, right? There's the Emancipation Proclamation saying we will not compensate owners when slaves are freed, there will not be colonization, and all of a sudden Lincoln becomes the great emancipator. So if you take a look at this Freedom to the Slave broadside, this tells you a little bit about how Americans perceived emancipation was achieved, right? They see this as emancipation is something that the white soldier, the Union soldier, gave to the slave, freedom to the slave, and they point out ways that freedom will be different than slavery, right? You have school, reading, family life, that's a plow on the left, so work, and it'll be very different from slavery and the violence that was in slavery. Here's an image of some black soldiers who served in the Union. Only a few served early on. Many African Americans in the North worked as sailors. They served on ships. It took them a little longer to serve on land. By the beginning of the war, they're serving as cooks, laundresses, laborers. But only after the Emancipation Proclamation did the Union begin to recruit blacks to serve to fight. So by the end of the war, 181,000 African American men served in the Union Army, 24,000 in the Navy. A third of them died in battle or from wounds. 15 received the Medal of Honor, which is the highest award for military valor. Now, they did serve in segregated units. And the movie Glory is based on the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, which are free blacks under the leadership of Robert Gould Shaw. And if you would like extra credit, you can watch the movie and write me a one-page response to the movie. Just send it to my email. The movie shows the African American soldiers treated the same as white soldiers in separate regiments. They were actually paid less. Black soldiers were paid $10 a month rather than $16 a month. But however they served, serving was a liberating experience for African Americans. Liberating in not the strict sense, right? They didn't necessarily gain freedom. They were already free. But it was a way to give them some sort of political acumen. About 130 of the soldiers, or the 130 African Americans who served as soldiers, held political office after the end of the Civil War, right? But Reconstruction, that time period after the Civil War, really erases the memory of the thousands of Civil War soldiers, African American soldiers who served in the Civil War. Of the thousands of Civil War monuments, only 10 contain images of a black soldier in America. And so this history has been largely erased by popular culture.